Today we are going to be talking about the food supply chain, and I'm actually really excited about this topic. It's going to be something that I've wanted to learn a lot about, and especially from an economist. So our first speaker today is James Foster. He's a professor of economics and international affairs here at the Elliott School. His work spans the fields of economic development, public economics, and economics theory. Okay, just checking. His current research topics include the measurement of multidimensional poverty, robustness of multidimensional comparisons, poverty in time, the ultra-poor, mobility and the middle class, and the role of aspirations in economic development. So, very interesting topic.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. Hello, everyone. How is everyone today? Pretty good? Did everyone bring your food with you? I see you have. Is that, what kind of food was that, by the way? Oh, you can't talk. Of course, you can't work. Well, I am not an expert on food, except as much as you're an expert on food. But what I do know is economics, and what I've tried to learn about is the notion of provenance. I've been doing work in this area for quite a while now. And provenance, as I describe it, is linking up the product that you're consuming right now with where it came from. How was it produced? Under what conditions? And so forth. I think this is the key issue, and the authentic conveying of that information is the key issue about what we'll be talking about today. And I believe the second speakers, when they have come right through the door. Hello, how are you doing? Dawn, welcome. This is Dawn from, what was your last name again, Dawn?
Valino.
Valino from Founding Farmers. So welcome to the GW Elliott School of International Affairs. Great. We'll get someone to put your thing on in just a second. All right, as I said, we'll probably it will relate to the second discussion as well, but we'll have to see, won't we? Food supply chain. Before I define it, I wanted to go to this picture. Yes, that's exactly what I thought of when I thought of food chain. No. Food supply chain, definition, and this is a pretty reasonable definition of it. It's the processes or the system by which food goes from the farm to the consumer's plate. The farm to the fork, some people might say. It's usually represented by the entities, firms, farms, stores, retailers, all of them, at each stage of this particular process, and by their roles. We often denote them by the role, a distributor, a retailer, a farmer, a producer. But it also includes a description of the activities, the information flows, and if you don't think information is important in all of this, it is. It's extremely important, even though it's hard to draw a picture with information in it. It includes the resources that are used, and at least when we talk about sustainable supply chains, when we really look at what's happening with the materials, it involves the waste in transforming the natural resources into the final product. We often call the food supply chain the name of the most visible entity. So for instance, we might say the McDonald's food supply chain. So as I said, the picture, no, that's not it. That's the right picture. I like this picture because it had a two-way flow, fully reflecting what's going on in a food supply chain. In one direction, we're starting with the producer on the left-hand side. The farmer is doing what farmers do, sending it off to the processor to make the food into units that can then be distributed and reach the retailer, who then gives it to us, the consumer. But at the same time and simultaneously in the other direction, and this is where your power comes in, folks, so remember this other direction. The consumer is giving dollars to the next person in the chain, which is the retailer. It goes in the other direction to the distributor, the processor, and the farmer. The two-way flow of resources and money mean that a supply chain has, along with it, a money demand chain. Food goes one way, right? The goods are moving in one direction, and money is moving in the other direction. But actually, that picture is much too simple. I know it's impossible to read, don't worry about it. This is a food supply chain for milk. Now, it's, again, as with any model, it's a simplification. Okay, but on the left-hand side, you have cows, and on the right-hand side, you have consumers. And the stuff that's in between is the stuff that's in between, including farm tanks, bigger 5,500-gallon trucks, then 50K gallon silos that are out there to gather the stuff, processing lines, finished goods, distributors, retailers, you got it. So this is an example of what I would call better a food supply network or a food supply web, and it's also known by that name. In fact, this is even too simple. Imagine what must go into this picture of a pizza. Now, this is your standard run-of-the-mill pizza that you'd get in high school. There are the ingredients. How many suppliers for those ingredients there could be? How many sourcing? Where is it from? The picture would be impossible to draw. It's much more complicated. To stress the complicated nature of what we're about to talk about, I gave you an assignment to read this interesting essay that I read as a college student called I Pencil. Now, forgive me, it's horribly antiquated. The gendered language is impossible to get past. And it's clearly on one side of the political spectrum or the other. I don't quite know which one. But learn the lessons from it. The lessons are that a very simple commodity, commodities are things that are identical. You get one, you get another, you get another. They all look the same. It's a commodity. It's not a specialty good, it's a commodity. This simple commodity that we write with has very complicated origins. That markets decentralize the decisions by which all these different actors are working on their part of this very simple pencil to create what's needed to bring it to you at a very cheap cost. The markets do this by decentralizing the decisions. They achieve efficient allocations, efficient meaning little is wasted along the way. And this is all done through the free choice of individuals who aren't being told you have to do this. It's a glorious discussion, okay? It's the ethos of economists. This is what economists bow down to. And they say, Adam Smith, 1776, was the one who showed us this great insight. I should mention to you that Adam Smith only mentioned it once, and it was not his key point in the book, and that he, in fact, believes the government should do a lot more to regulate, to help the poor, and so on. So it's a little misleading. Nonetheless, let's go on and hear our friend Milton Friedman. Do we have, there we go.
Look at this lead pencil.
Typical
There's
economist.
not a single person in the world who could make this pencil. Remarkable statement? Not at all. The wood from which it's made, for all I know, comes from a tree that was cut down in the state of Washington. To cut down that tree, it took a saw. To make the saw, it took steel. To make the steel, it took iron ore. This black center, we call it lead, but it's really graphite, compressed graphite. I'm not sure where it comes from, but I think it comes from some mines in South America. This red top up here, the eraser, bit of rubber, probably comes from Malaya, where the rubber tree isn't even native. It was imported from South America by some businessmen with the help of the British government. This brass ferrule, I haven't the slightest idea where it came from, or the yellow paint or the paint that made the black lines, or the glue that holds it together. Literally thousands of people cooperated to make this pencil. People who don't speak the same language, who practice different religions, who might hate one another if they ever met. When you go down to the store and buy this pencil, you are in effect trading a few minutes of your time for a few seconds of the time of all those thousands of people. What brought them together and induced them to cooperate to make this pencil? There was no commissar sending out orders from some central office. It was a magic of the price system, the impersonal operation of prices that brought them together and got them to cooperate to make this pencil so that you could have it for a trifling sum. That is why the operation of the free market is so essential, not only to promote productive efficiency, but even more, to foster harmony and peace among the peoples of the world.
I thought you'd like that. Yeah, it gets a little bit hokey at the end there, folks. Sorry, guys. But the truth is that it shows you the depth of the market. It's outlandishly complicated, and it's being done every second of every day. Think about this graph. Has anyone seen it before? I've seen it. Most people have. Anyone not seen it? How about that? Okay, supply and demand. Standard story, that's what Milton Friedman is talking about, Nobel Prize winner. Quantity on this axis, price on the vertical axis. Quantity of what, price of what? Well, it has to be something, and it has to be something understood and uniform, but that's okay. It's whatever the commodity is. This is the building block. The cool thing about economics is that it says, wow, with this tool, I can understand many phenomena in the world. Milton Friedman uses this to understand supply chains. But let's see where Milton might be wrong. Here's Milton's idea of what went on in that supply chain. If he applied it to the food supply chain, here's where he'd have a supply and demand that moderates the interactions between farmers and processors, right? A supply and demand that moderates what's happening between the next links of the chain, all the way up to the consumer. Supply and demand at every point. Everything working anonymously, you don't have to know who the other people are in the chain. In fact, he said at one point, for all I know, it's a Malaysian rubber. Who knows where this is coming from, right? He doesn't know what any of the items that made up the pencil were coming from. The fact is, though, that it doesn't describe reality too well. Moreover, there's a lot that needs to be said before you can conclude the kinds of things that were tacked on at the end of the last discussion. This is well functioning only under very severe assumptions. The kinds of assumptions are, number one, that every single unit of good that goes through the market is identical. It's a commodity. They're uniform. Remember last week when the secretary was discussing uniformity of product? It's what big corporations would love. Okay? That's the model. Second, industrial organization. That means how is the industry organized? For this model to work, you have to have many producers, many consumers. No one can have market power. Does that sound like what we were described last week? Of course not. Great market power all over the place. Oligopolies, major corporations that control the industries almost. Finally, information has to be complete and freely available. But wait a minute, I haven't seen whether my Cheerios have GMO in it or not. Does it? Well, actually, they just changed that policy, but that's a different story altogether. We'll talk about it later. Imperfections lead to problems for markets. The invisible hand that Milton Friedman talks about begins to falter. And the key problem that occurs is that prices don't reflect the full costs or the full benefits of what's going through the market. Okay? The implication is my choice ignores the impact on others outside of the market that I'm in choosing things, right? So if I'm a producer and doing something, my actions are creating pollution over here. I'm not taking that into account in my discussion. That's called an externality. It's the term that's used by economists for these kinds of effects that are outside the market. They can be good. For instance, someone plants a lot of flowers, I really enjoy it. That's a positive externality. They can be bad and be called negative externalities. Some examples. Here are some people. These are people outside the supply chain. They can be directly affected by what goes on in the supply chain. Let's look at the examples. Outside the supply chain, you could have a painting facility that leaks all this goop into the water supply and causes kids to have deformities when they're born. This happened right next to where I used to teach at Vanderbilt. Old growth trees could be destroyed. Palm oil production compromises orangutan habitats. Child labor could be used in the production of certain activities. Now, mind you, I'm an economist. I have to look at the full effect of child labor, and child labor could, for very poor people, help the people in the short run. The family may not be able to survive without kids working. So I say negative for the long run, but certainly could be positive in the short run. Industry could create an infrastructure that helps other industries with what they need to do. Mind you, that too could be negative. When I was in college like yourself, there was a very natural distribution chain that came from Colombia up to Florida, where I was. You might remember that time. When I was in college, it was mostly marijuana, but that supply chain, that method of moving product into the United States was there already when cocaine became the big issue. They just followed right in. So, infrastructure that's existing can help other firms with what they're trying to do. Negative or positive, I don't know. Solutions. When you have people outside the supply chain affected by the actors in the supply chain, one of the ways of dealing with it is regulation. There can be suits, so the courts can get involved. There can be self-regulation through corporate social responsibility. Or, most important of all, consumers have to be informed. I mean, that's simply what has to be. So here's the second type of externality. I've talked about externalities affecting people outside the chain. You can also have one participant in the chain affecting another participant. Okay? So in this case, a farmer and a retailer can directly impact one another. Examples. Your product's quality can affect my firm, my product's reputation. This is a big issue. And by the way, since I have so many suppliers, let's say everyone in this room is a supplier to me and I have the retail brand name out there, one of you messing up can tarnish my brand. It's kind of like an O-ring model, an O-ring example of the space shuttle Challenger. It took just $1 and some odd cents piece, one item out of billions in the darn thing, that failed, and it caused the failure of the entire shuttle. It's that kind of problem that leads to a necessity for all of us to work together in a chain to make sure this doesn't happen. Likewise, your temporary shortages may impact my consumers because they can't get the good now. Your product's reputation is affected by how well I present and store it. So now I'm the retailer, and I'm bringing your product in with your brand on it, and all of a sudden I let it get rotten right in the shelves, and people say it's always rotten. This can have a negative effect. Jennifer, how are you? Good. There is interrelated there are interrelated payoffs among all the players of this game. How many people are in my game theory class? This is a game. It's a game which is, as we'll describe later, a cooperative game where people work together to maximize somehow a joint product. But it's a game. It could be non-cooperative, but in the world we'll be describing right now, there has been a change to thinking about this, not as independent people, not as independent entities, but as entities working together to achieve common goals. It turns out that externalities to economists are bad, but externalities to a marketer and to people with vision represent possibilities, right? These are what they call synergies. You can exploit these synergies by working together. This is the situation where you have a win-win game, not a zero-sum game. So what can you do about it? Well, one way is for a firm to basically take over all parts of the chain and coordinate and receive the extra benefits through the synergies, right? Because if there's a problem with this person affecting this person's right outcome, their payoff, well, if they're both the same person, they do what's best for them. One way then is to have what's called vertical integration. And it's one of the reasons why you have very, very large business entities in this particular sector. What they're doing is internalizing the externalities, internalizing the synergies, so they can incorporate this and make more money. After that, it's all just logistics, making sure things go from here to there as directed from the center. So it's just like Friedman saying, no one orders it. Yes, they do in this case. The second solution to these within the chain externalities is supply chain management. If you have people affecting each other in the supply chain, guess what? You can get together, discuss, cooperate, and then tie each other up in contracts. That's exactly what happens in many, many cases. In fact, the whole idea of having spot markets for all the commodities along the chain makes no sense whatsoever. You want to plan ahead, and therefore you need to tie in people ahead of time, for a year ahead of time many times, right? And so you have to have some way of contracting across that, and the way is done through these sort of legal institutions that we've developed in this country and most others. Ronald Coase talked about this situation. Can you have a market? Should you have a vertically integrated firm or something in between like a contract? And he described when one would happen and the other wouldn't. If markets have too many transactions costs, it's just too hard to find the person, make it happen, and then try and agree on what'll happen is you'll have a contract moving into the vertically integrated firm. It'll all come inside of a firm where it can be command as opposed to the bargaining. It also, well, we'll talk about that later. Next up, a discussion of supply chain management. What does it mean? Let's go back to the definition of a food supply chain. Here's a picture of something that needs to be managed. Can you imagine, once again, I use pizza as the example with extraordinary number of ingredients. Well, look, there's the California red onions. Traveled 3,000 miles for this processed pizza. Canadian wheat, remember that's from outside the country, so you have to have all kinds of importing regulations that are paid attention to. Mushrooms, there's all kinds of challenges, including getting these things on time, fresh enough so that they're still good when you cook them into your pizza. What happens if you're stuck and your regular supplier doesn't have what you need? It's tough. So there's lots and lots of problems that are solved by supply chain management. Food supply chains can be viewed through a lot of different lenses. The most natural one is perhaps the product itself as it moves up and down the chain. And this is the transformation of the food materials as they're produced, collected, processed, moved around, and eventually sold. And perhaps not sold. They could wind up in the garbage. And as we heard last week, in the dumps to create methane, right? So why is this way of looking at the food supply chain important? Well, this is the natural way for thinking about food safety. It's that product. Where is it? How long has it been in the chain? Is it being taken care of all along the way? Food qualities of various types. Notice that the term is a plural. Food has multiple qualities, each of which may be exceptionally important to different people. Finally, in discussing waste and environmental sustainability, a big issue now, you have to view it this way. So here's a picture with a reconstituted food supply chain in which the trash can is put in. It's that trash can that receives a lot, maybe a third of the food as it's passing, the food product as it passes through. So it's the greatest consumer of all, isn't it? Roughly 1/3 of food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted globally, which amounts to this much, which is more than all food production in sub-Saharan Africa. This gets into my poverty area of research, and you just wonder, isn't there a way to make it work? Here's a description of where the waste occurs for your information. North America and Oceania. Red is consumer. Gray is production to retailing. Yeah, that's you guys and me. Sub-Saharan Africa, no surprise, there is a care that's taken by consumers not to waste, by necessity. By the way, is waste necessary? I mean, yeah, we talked last time about some food that doesn't look that good and it just gets tossed. Well, here's an example where food preferences over food by consumers can actually change the amount of waste that's going on. During the 2012 growing season in the United Kingdom and England, it was really a terrible time. I mean, the fruit looked terrible, if any of it grew, and so forth. So what happened was that the chains were struggling. What can we do? Where can we get our fruit from, et cetera? They want to continue doing the homegrown stuff. How do they do it? They change the qualifications for a fruit. Now, fruit that didn't look good, fruit that was misshapen, fruit that was healthy and tasty, but just the outside wasn't what we would expect, now came through the standard food chain, food supply chain. Sainsbury took it and told customers, look, we've had a bad season, here's what we have. Customers loved it. They took this stuff, ate it like crazy, and it became a big fad. Waste was reduced, and this is a positive story. It shows you consumers can make a difference. Second, there's a second way of looking at a food supply chain. It is industrial organization. How are the industries organized? What does it mean, industrial organization? It means the number and market power of the various companies that are in this sector or in the chain, how they set the prices, what prices are set for what they pay, right? What they pay for inputs and also for what they get paid for outputs, for what they put down the road. So this has a focus on the other direction. The product was going in one direction, now the dollars are coming in this direction. And it's the structure of the industry that influences who gets what along the chain. Who's got the power? Who's able to say to you, well, look, I don't need to go to you, I'll go over here. Right? That's called elasticity, right? You can actually turn around and say, I don't need you, I'm going here. I have flexibility. Flexible people have much more strength. If you're stuck and you need it, you're going to pay top dollar. Okay. Why is this important? Well, there's a lot of policy issues that are related to this very structure, the industrial organization. First of all, it impacts consumer prices. So at the far end where the consumer is, they start complaining when prices are much too high. And we've seen a lot of big food spikes in the last decade. Well, consumers certainly have been complaining because of that. More so, if people complain here because of high prices, guess what's going on in the poorer parts of the world where people can't even get food because it's just way out of their price range. Second, the incomes of family farms. Now, mind you, that's the other side of the equation, right? Because it's on the left-hand side, and the family farm, if there were high prices to consumers, you'd think they're going to make a lot of money. Answer, not necessarily. Because there's a lot of entities in between. And these entities themselves are setting prices or taking prices, right? And that's determining how much a flow of dollars is going back to the farmer. We've seen that there's a disappearing middle. We talked about it last time. That big farm is out there, the big industry is out there, and a bunch of little tiny farms. What's going on in the middle? This is a big problem, and one which can be seen as related to the industrial organization around the food supply chain. Finally, the one everyone talks about, the excess power of the really big corporations to do what they want, to set prices, to set quality, and to set the rules of the game that determine those other two. On the other hand, remember, they're the same companies that are extremely efficient at producing food for you and me. So there's this other side of it. Very efficient, but with a lot of power. Here's an example of what's going on in various industries. This is old, but it's more or less the same now. For various food sectors, beef packing, pork production, broilers, dairies, et cetera, et cetera. The different companies that are the top four in sales in that particular sector. Add up all the percentages of sales, and you get this number down here. This is a very standard measure of concentration or consolidation in an industry. Concentrated. Concentrated. Sort of concentrated. The rest concentrated. I mean, it's pretty consolidated. Okay? So this is the reality that we face in lots and lots of sectors of the food supply chain. Finally, the strategic way of thinking about a food supply chain. This is the discussion of supply chain management, which began, I suppose, in the 1980s. There was a lot of discussion of this. It hit the business schools, let's say, in the 90s, and it really took off. The key aspect is how one entity affects another within the chain. And recognizing that interdependence leads to a desire to coordinate the different entities, to work together to achieve some kind of common end to help each of us. Now, in the thing I handed out, it described that there's this movement that's kind of domino-like with one affecting the other back and forth. And that's indeed the case. This is important as a way of viewing the supply chain for food, because it turns out that once you view it this way, it isn't just a competition between different brands, but it's like that commercial where the guy's got the phone, walks up, and then all these people come behind. Okay, that's a few years ago. It's the brand, the retailer, or the name that's attached to the supply chain, and then everyone else. It's a competition between supply chains. It isn't just a competition anymore between Coke and Pepsi. Well, it is there, but it isn't just a competition between McDonald's. Well, maybe it is there, but you get my point. You have these suppliers who can do what you need to do to help you market your goods as well as you're helping them in the production. Everyone can help each other identify the profitable direction or the direction that achieves whatever values and ends you want. It doesn't necessarily have to be just profit. So the terminology is you need to optimize the supply chain. You need to do this to remain competitive because someone else is optimizing their supply chain. That's the game. Now this is different from individual optimization we talk about in economics all the time. I optimize, I do the best I can, independent of all of you guys. And that's indeed what Friedman talks about. It's not that at all. It's we get together and act cooperatively, okay? Shared goals to respect the differences along the supply chain, of course. But in order to do this, you have to have some kind of long-term relationship. Is this economics? And trust. Is that economics? The answer is it is economics. It's the right way of thinking about economics. There are a lot of issues in food supply chains. And I mentioned just a few of them here. Globalization has led to a proliferation of long chains going all over the world back and forth. Imagine keeping track of that from a regulation point of view. Lots of laws have been passed recently to try to do that, but it's still tough to figure out what to do. Traceability. Can you really know who it was that brought you those soybeans or gave you that kale? Under what conditions was it produced? They want to know this in order to make sure it fits in with what they're producing. Traceability, very important. Perishability. Food supply chains are different from most supply chains because there's this element of we got to get it through or else it is no good. It's related to supply chains for services. Like an airplane. That seat on an airplane perishes. If we don't get someone to fit in that seat, it's gone. How about someone working on software sitting somewhere in India, Bangalore? They're ready to go. If there's no one to outsource to them, their time is lost. So services are very similar to the type of perishability we see along food supply chains. Social responsibility, a buzzword, mind you, but it's a good buzzword, one that makes firms think beyond the bottom line, perhaps to a second bottom line or a third or a fourth. Transparency, exposing yourself, telling what you're doing to others for the purposes of making sure that everyone understands and is clear about your goals, clear that you're doing the right thing. Examples of this include the discussion I sent you on Mars, where they've decided to go into the palm oil that they're using in their products and make sure that they're certified to be from areas that don't cut down a ton of trees and plant these palm trees, because that's what's been happening over time, ruining habitat. McDonald's, surprisingly enough, I believe that it was José Andrés who mentioned first to me that McDonald's is an extremely efficient, in terms of energy, right, restaurant. They're very efficient. Go online and you can see it. There's a lot of discussion of how efficient they are. So this too is an important aspect. But the question always is there for all of us to think about, is what you see online or is what you have heard about in articles, is it authentic or is it marketing? Is it greenwashing, which is worse than marketing? Marketing's good. I'm talking about greenwashing, like whitewashing, but with green stuff. So this feeds right into the discussion of provenance, which I'll have in just a second. GMOs. who in the chain should know whether you're using these genetically modified stuff in your food? Well, how do you optimize or coordinate without telling each other in the supply chain? So that's a good reason for making it clear. But food companies are worried about the far right-hand side, the consumer. Will turn around and say, forget it. There's nothing that's wrong with this according to all the results that I've seen, but I'm not convinced. There may be. We don't know. And consequently, they won't buy the item. If you put a label on the package that said GMO, then that would surely scare the customer off. That's what they're worried about. Mind you, General Mills has recently made Cheerios GMO-free, and this followed Whole Foods and a number of other companies that have considered this to be an issue that's important enough to do something about. Big companies wanted the ability to withhold this information from the public. What do you think? How many people vote to withhold? Well, that's 10% less than the general population. In other words, 90% think that we shouldn't withhold this information from our products. At the very least, you should be able to go online and find it out. I want to provide this example. It's a great example called the values-based supply chain. And this is started at the University of California, Davis, although, I mean, that's their topic area. They're studying it and trying to get farmers to follow it so that they can have bigger incomes. It's a great thing. And what they claim, what's going on in this model, is that farmers and ranchers are having their identities preserved on the product itself. Who is it that made this food? This value supply chain, likewise, is incorporating environmental, social, and community values into production. Organic, sustainable, family farmed, etc. The idea is to build trust both within the chain and outside. I want to go outside a little bit because it's the consumer, which is part of the chain, but yet is often considered to be outside. This is called a trace and trust approach. You should know where it's coming from, and you should be able to tell others where it's coming from. But the key here is the ability to communicate an authentic story. This is where this is from. This is where the product is from. Here's the person. Here's the condition, etc. This relates to my discussion of provenance and to our guest today. Note, by the way, the dual meaning of values. There's shared values, the values of environmental and social community concerns, but also the fair value going to all parts of the chain. But also one more, it's not dual, it's triple. Very often it's trying to get at a high quality for low price for the consumer. That's really where the value comes in. So, of course, fair values for all members includes the consumer, but I'm focusing on that for that last statement. Now, I did have you look at this great study by the USDA, which noted very high interest in local products by consumers, by governments, policymakers, for these reasons. There's many policies that interact, which you've heard about in class. This is a trend. The trend is decentralization of food supply, food processing, that isn't going to go away. And what it showed was that local products can, in fact, integrate into mainstream supply chain. They do. There's 3 types of supply chain studied: the mainstream, direct market, and something in between, and 5 regions. Key findings were that local products tend to provide more information, which I would call provenance information. They enter the mainstream chain, but actually there's a very low percentage. They generate income locally, but it's seasonal, and it's something that's not that large compared to other sources. They have lower transport costs, but higher per unit transport costs. And sometimes There's enough there to support premiums of local over the sort of mainstream, but it usually takes some other characteristic, organic, grass-fed, et cetera, so forth. And there's a great case on the DC milk market, which I'll ask questions of when I'm done. Now, I want to have a brief, maybe 3-minute discussion of the key ingredient of a value-based supply chain. It's really simple. It's called provenance. This is authentic information given consumers the power to do good in the world. So you can have the power to do good in the world if you have this information. So what makes us buy stuff? Anyone know? If you're a marketer, someone who studies marketing, you'd answer, well, there's 3-4 things. Yeah. Price, product, promotion, place. Place is distribution, what we've been talking about. But there's one more that economists would add. And yes, that's a very typical economist for those of you. You can click on this when you get this. You'll get a copy of him talking in Ferris Bueller. He is boring, let me tell you. He actually grew up just down the way here in Maryland. Anyone had any classes from Tony Yaser? Tony Yaser? Classmate of Tony's. Okay. Consumer sovereignty is the power of consumers to determine what goods and services are produced. You have a choice. You get to provide the dollars any way you want, based on your preferences and values. But consumers need all the relevant information to make an informed choice. The material aspects as well as the non-material aspects. These new forms of sovereignty demand info on labor conditions. Was this produced by child labor? By labor that was terrible? Coerced? Carbon footprint? Conflict zones? Sustainability? Fair price? Is it locally grown? Actually, information on supply chains and more. But how can you be sure this information is accurate? If it isn't accurate, you're not going to buy. Why should you be fooled? I call it provenance, and let me give you an example of provenance. This is from the art field first. That is a sketching. The one on the left I found online with one of the, like, eBay. It's Picasso. Which would have more value, the Picasso on the left or the Picasso on the right that had papers authenticating the artist in the chain of ownership? They're the same thing. But wait a minute, one of them has papers, yes? The one on the right, I agree. Okay, we're in agreement here. The one on the left, which is a great Stratocaster, it's going to cost you about, I don't know, $1,500, maybe $2,000, who knows? Or the one on the right with papers authenticating ownership by Jimi Hendrix and the chain of ownership. The one on the right went for about $150,000. One on the left goes for 10% of that. Yes, greater value because of the knowledge and the authentication. What would you pay for 12 of these? The one on the left, which you know nothing about, and the one on the right, which has authentic information that Farmer Sutton, who raised the chickens and laid the eggs, allowed them to range freely and were raised organically. Typically, the one on the right has greater value. I know some buyers in the room here who would not buy the ones on the left, but would buy the ones potentially on the right. And of course, coffee. The one on the left or the one on the right? The one on the left is probably $1 and change. The one on the right is around $3.50. I know which one you pay for. Provenance means to come from. It's valuable information about the history of a product that creates a link between people through the product. The source is Broccoli and Desire, a great book by Ted Fisher, an anthropologist, and a memo that I've written with him. This is information that isn't available from the physical product typically. I mean, it can go beyond the physical to the non-material. So where is this from? Terroir in wine. Nike, how was it produced? If it was produced under slave labor conditions, there's problems. Is it locally sourced? Also, Killing provenance is a pastime of a lot of folks. Vague supply chains in provenance. Laundering, so that you have, this melamine in milk. A problem in China with the supply chain there, killed a lot of people. Mortgages in 2006 that caused the financial disaster. Where did they come from? These mortgages were without any, or you don't know who those mortgages were for and under what conditions they were extracted. Horse meat hamburgers, tilapia for snapper. Do I need to go on? Who can provide provenance information? Firms themselves, by brand, reputation, but is it authentic or not? Independent organizations like fair trade associations or the Green Restaurant Association. And the government can allow labeling regulations to go to the internet. Guess what? You can provide provenance information through your research. Consumers empowered by the web with these QR codes and apps linked with the media can do a heck of a lot. So my challenge to you is to find your issue in this particular space, in the food space. Generate provenance, manage your supply chain, or is it your money demand chain? Consume wisely, but I warn you, don't go overboard.
Don is the Vice President of Operations for the Farmers Restaurant Group, okay. Which includes family farmers, and I have to write this down because we can never remember the order of farmers, fishers, and bakers. Your new location in Georgetown. Okay. She has a background in restaurant concepting, business development, procurement, and both the front and the back side of restaurant operations. Yes, which was very interesting. And she's worked for over 250 different restaurants.
That is correct.
Wow.
Indirectly.
Indirectly.
I've worked with over 250 different restaurants.
Well, and these are some big names. Five Guys, Pete's Coffee, Jason's Deli, Palms Steakhouse, Buffalo Wild Wings, and many other different companies. So we are really lucky to have Dawn here today with us to talk a little bit more about food supply chain.
Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today about what we do at what I will call the farm. The Farmers Restaurant Group operates 3 restaurants in the DC metropolitan area. We operate 3 restaurants in the area, one on Pennsylvania Avenue, which hopefully some of you are familiar with. Founding Farmers. Farmers, Fishers, and Bakers on the waterfront in Georgetown has been open for a little over a year and 2 months. And Founding Farmers in Potomac and Montgomery County, north of the Beltway, out in the suburbs, is a sister restaurant to the Founding Farmers on Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm going to talk to you today about how we make decisions regarding what we buy, where it comes from, and then how we take all of those factors into consideration when we build our menus and figure out what we're going to put on the menus that you will hopefully come in and buy from. The Farmers Restaurant Group is primarily owned by 40,000 American family farmers of the North Dakota Farmers Union. There's an interesting story about how we came to be. We've been in Washington, D.C. for 5 years, a little more than 5 years maybe. And as I just covered, the 3 restaurants that we operate. I'm the director of, we call farm operations for the 3 restaurants. And I wear a few hats. One of them is I manage the procurement side of our business. So I figure out what we're going to buy. I help negotiate what we're going to pay for those items. And somewhere in all of those diagrams that you saw about supply chain, I pop up here and there to make sure that I'm looking after our company's needs and the needs of our guests. So that's you folks. We call you guests. And a successful business, of course, has you at the end of that diagram that we saw up there several times. We are currently working on our 4th restaurant in the Tyson's Corner area of Virginia, hoping that we'll be open in September of 2014. So we're in the middle of figuring out a whole nother great big group of procurement decisions and figuring out how what we're calling the Virginia Farm, I think I can say, fits into our family restaurant group here in the DC area. We serve approximately 30 to 40,000 guests per month per restaurant. I hope that sounds as overwhelming to you as it feels to me sometimes, especially on a Saturday. And we're proud to say that we have we're a small restaurant company. We have 3 busy restaurants, and we're growing slowly and carefully, and with our guests' best interests in mind. Our mantra is top quality, fresh, natural ingredients, and everything through the eyes of the farmer. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how we use that philosophy to make the decisions that we make every day. I'm messing it up, aren't I? There we go. And I too have a video to show that hopefully won't be just a commercial, right? And I'm just going to push play, right? Yeah. Okay.
It's lunchtime at Founding Farmers in Washington, D.C., a top dining destination in the nation. Just 3 blocks from the White House, Founding Farmers looks like a modern-day farmhouse. The downstairs dining room has a central bar surrounded by rough-hewn farm tables with bird-shaped pendant lights and clouds overhead. Upstairs is a pastry bar and comfy booths for cozy and intimate dining. As for the menu,
ProFish has worked with Founding Farmers since before this place opened. So we sat down, helped them develop their menu as far as the fish goes, local, sustainable caught fish, sometimes swimming that day or the day before.
Founding Farmers is all about fresh and seasonal ingredients.
We are the greenest restaurant in Washington, D.C. When it's the food that we put on the plate, we look local when possible, from family farms, real food and real drink, and this food is made from scratch.
The expansive menu covers breakfast, lunch, and dinner for every food craving. Chicken and waffles, devilish eggs, and fried green tomatoes. Or try one of their signature dishes, Yankee pot roast. Even the desserts are amazing. How about a slice of red velvet cake or Edna's famous carrot cake? Watch it being made right here by award-winning pastry chefs.
It's great to be able to show our guests what we make every day, all from scratch.
And their award-winning pre-prohibition style bar offers unique drink options.
You've got to try the Sazerac. It is made with our Founding Farmers rye. We make the whiskey right down the road. It's fantastic, and it makes maybe the best cocktail on the planet.
Founding Farmers restaurants are very popular, so you'll definitely want to call ahead for a reservation. So what keeps them coming back? Everything.
So that tells you a little bit about, you saw some pictures of our restaurant in DC. Our fish vendor, ProFish, is a local fish company. We buy from them. We buy different fish literally every day of the week. The fish selection changes based on what's available, what's fresh. We always know where the fish come from. We always know when they were caught, how they were caught, and the time between when they stop swimming and get to the restaurant is as short as we can make it reasonably. I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of supply chain from our perspective. So there should be some similarities and some synergies with the lecture so far. What I'm going to try to do is help you understand what all those terms and big words to me anyway mean in real life when we're actually trying to figure out what do we buy, how do we buy it, how do we store it, how are we going to make it in time to feed it to you at 7 o'clock on Saturday night when the other 1,000 guests want to eat at the same time. It's sort of a fun puzzle to figure out every day and every week, and the procurement side of it is really important to us. What is our strategic outlook? So there are lots of buzzwords. I believe you use the term greenwashing. There are lots of buzzwords that you hear in almost any retail outlet that sells food that you go to now. Things like organic, natural, made from scratch. There are a lot of ways to use those things. And so when our founders were putting together the concept of the farm, we had to ask ourselves all of those questions. What does it mean? Because when you make a promise like organic, that's a very specific, that's a word, it has a definition. The FDA has defined it, it's part of labeling. When you make a promise like that, you have to keep it. And so our perspective comes from the idea that we want to put fresh, made from scratch, always, in any way, in every way that we can. We do things like we make our own mayonnaise, and you'll be hard pressed to visit 5 restaurants in DC in one day that make their own mayonnaise. Farm to fork sourcing, what that means for us is that whenever possible, we would prefer to buy from the farm rather than a big distributor or rather than the 3,000 cogs down the chain that you saw earlier. Fresh and holistic, always as fresh as possible. There are some things we can't always get fresh. There's some things we can get fresh certain times of the year and not others. And sustainable at every turn. So it's very important to us that we know, if we're talking about meat, we want to know how the animals were raised, what they were fed, what the process was to get them from the farm to the table. And it's important to us that along the way we're good to the environment. So sustainable to us means how can we run a business, serve a lot of food to a lot of people in a high volume atmosphere, and still take good care of the environment, our community, our neighbors, and so on and so forth. And then of utmost importance to us is a value-driven experience. So we make a lot of promises to you, our consumers, and one of the promises we make is that when you come and eat in our restaurants, you should feel like you've received a good value. So it would be easy for us to say everything's all natural, we buy from local farmers, and it costs $19 instead of $14 because of that. That's an easy way to make extra money in our business, and it's an easy slippery slope, so to speak, when you're a restaurant operator trying to make decisions. We haven't raised prices in the 5 years that we've been in Washington, D.C. And that's because of our commitment to a value-driven restaurant group. So we decided we're going to figure out how to do this better and not make you pay more money for it. It's a big, tough challenge, and some days we wonder why. When our neighbors charge $24 for the same entree that we do, and maybe ours is better. I think ours is better. Planning and decision making, how does that apply to the menu? So what that means for us is that when we get together as a team, Chef Joe, Chef Chuck, the principals of the company, and myself, the voice of reason, I think, when we get together to plan the menus, we have to think about all these things. So seasonality, chef-driven, made from scratch, that's a core value that we have, so we start there. Seasonal changes based on what's available regionally, and then balancing all those decisions. So there are probably lots of you in the room that if you came in today for a cheeseburger and we told you couldn't have tomato on your cheeseburger because they're not ripe in this area right now, you'd probably be pretty bummed if you really like tomatoes. So we have to make decisions like, are we not going to sell tomatoes certain times of the year, or is it going to be okay for us to bring tomatoes from California certain times of the year? And so then there is a series of other questions that go with that. How were they raised? Were they treated with chemicals? Tomatoes are sort of an easy one to break down, but there are lots of others. Chickens, for example. Is it important to us that our chickens come from within 100 miles? Or is it more important that we know that they were free-range chickens that were not treated with hormones or antibiotics? Do they have to be air-chilled? Does that produce a better taste? Is that worth the money that we pay for it? I could go on and on and on, and you would be frustrated because you wouldn't make it to your next class. But there are decisions like that in every single thing that we decide to buy. Right now, we want to buy sugar from the Dakotas because we're associated with North Dakota family farmers, and we figured out that there's sugar made by some of the farmers who probably have some interest in our restaurant, and we can't figure out how to get it here. And so you get to a point where you have to ask yourself, is that worth, do you really care if the sugar came from Dakota? Is that a value? Is that a value to the guests and something you recognize, or is that just us being silly? There are other things like potatoes from the Dakotas that we decided were really important. So we work with a big regional distributor, convince them that we really want these potatoes from this farm in the Dakotas, or these small group of farms in the Dakotas, because we've been there, we've seen the farm, we know how the potatoes are raised, we know that the farmers care about the environment and they rotate crops and they practice all of these things that are important to us. So we spend the time, we spend the money, and we spend the resources, and if you come in and get French fries tonight, your potatoes came from the Dakotas, fresh, on a truck, and we cut them and prepared them for you this morning. I'll keep going. The reality of operations, and this is sort of, I guess I moved into this slide a little bit before we started talking about it. So it's difficult to keep our promises to the guests, to stay true to our mission, and to be profitable. Because at the end of the day, we're not really a part of the supply chain if we're not profitable, because we end up not there. And we have to ask ourselves every day, what do our guests really want? Do you want tomatoes on your burger in, what is this month, February? Or are you going to be more proud of us because we said no tomatoes, they're not ripe this time of year? Those are the sorts of things that we work through all the time. And then there are seasonal dilemmas and product displacement. The tomatoes are a good example of that. Salmon is another example of that. There are times of the year when we have wonderful line-caught sustainable or sustainably raised salmon available to us. And then there are times of the year where our fish vendors, several of them, will say we can't get the product that you want. So if you've ever been to the restaurant and had our plank salmon, it's one of the most popular things on the menu. So do we take it off the menu, or do we buy a product that doesn't stay true to our mission and keep our promises? Do we buy a product that's as close to the one that we love to buy and tell you about it? Those are the types of decisions that we make every day. I'm doing pretty well with the technology part. Supply chain challenges. So when we find, if I stay with the potatoes, we find something like the Dakota potatoes, we decide that, or we also get flour from the Dakotas, we decide that that's the product we want. There's lots of good reasons. It fits the brand. It keeps our promises to you. We think we figured out a way to do it reasonably economically. Then there's all these other pieces that come into it, and these are parts of that big grid with all those cogs in it, so to speak. So there are lead times. How do we get the potatoes to a distributor that's going to come here? Where are they going to be stored? What is the environment going to be like? What will the distribution fees be? It's a lot easier for us to tell Cisco, we just buy those potatoes you have, whatever the cheapest ones are. We're just cutting them up and putting them in grease and frying them anyway, right? That's an easy decision to make, and it's a cost-effective one. And so we push through all this. Quantity and volume are issues. Sometimes we find great local products. I found awesome turkeys last summer, and I wanted to buy turkeys from a local farm near Brookville, Maryland, where I live. And we started through the process. We worked out a price. And then we realized that particular farmer had enough turkeys to supply us in our 3 restaurants for about 7 days. And so it would have meant me telling our current turkey supplier that we're not going to buy turkeys from you, but just for 7 days. Or we had to make a realistic decision that just wasn't going to work for us. And then consistency sometimes is an issue. When you work really hard to buy from local vendors seasonal products that are ripe. If we stay with tomatoes, there's a short window when those tomatoes are amazing, and then they're overripe, or they didn't ripen all the way because it's starting to get cold. And so we have to sort our way through all that and figure it out. On a lot of products, we do a great job with that. We still have a long list of things that we'd like to be more regional and more seasonal with. The Cisco dilemma is a term that I coined when I first joined the farm. Occasionally, our guests will say, well, you're not really farm to fork. There's a Cisco truck out back. And that's a perception, and it's real, and it guides our guests' perceptions of us. And Jennifer, our marketing director, of course, is in charge of responding to the folks who vocalize that. But what about all the people who either read that review online, or they see the Cisco truck and they say that to their wife or their date, and it just becomes sort of an idea in their head that we never get a chance to explain. I threw it up here because you're all guests, and at least I get to tell 80 people. There are times, for example, those Dakota potatoes come through Cisco. Cisco's got distribution all over the country. They're a good partner of ours, or they have been a good partner of ours. And so that's the way we get that special product here. There are other more basic staples that simply aren't available in a more raw or better state. Things like sugar. I talked to you about the sugar from the Dakotas. What we really figured out is that there's not a lot of differentiation between how sugar's made at that particular farm or other places, or how it's processed. So there's times when we buy from Cisco. And we try really hard to make sure that decision isn't just because they had it the cheapest. That decision is based on that's the best product that we can get from all of the perspectives that are important to us, not just price. Our brand is holistic, so while local is relevant and it matters in season, and I think I've kind of covered this, it isn't the end all. What it's really about is what's the best product that we can serve to you today, keeping all of those things in mind for us. And we ourselves have to be sustainable, which means we have to make some money and be able to pay our employees and remain a part of the community. This is an example of just how far we go to make sure that we know where our products come from, and that we use products that we're proud of. So we make all of our own bread in our bakery location in Georgetown. All of our bread is made with North Dakota Mill's flour. And every year, Dan Simons, who's one of our principals, goes out to the mill, and he personally spends a day or two understanding how the grain is harvested in the field, how it gets from the field into those bins that were talked about earlier, similar scenario, into a silo, into bags, onto a truck, and to our facilities. And Dan goes out there every year to make sure that we feel good when we tell people our bread is made from scratch. It's made using all natural ingredients, no chemicals. The transportation and the storage is the best that we can find. And we feel good about the partnership with the North Dakota farmers. This is an example of what happens to that bread. So that flour that we've sourced and carefully chosen from the Dakotas comes into Georgetown, and every night at 1 o'clock in the morning, our bakery shift starts. And 3 or 4 bakers bake all night long for us, and this is what they produce for us. Does this one zoom in too? All right. And so this is a week's worth of bread for us. Probably some of the pieces up there are interesting. Down here, I don't know how well you can read, but this is a list of all the items that we use that one product in. So we'll talk about it a little bit in a minute, but it's important that when we go out and find something special like that flour, that we can utilize it in as many places on the menu as possible without the menu somehow all ending up tasting the same. We make our own pasta. We use the flour to make our own pasta. We use that same flour to thicken sauces. We use it for all these things that you can see up there, even in apple pie. This slide talks about my job, really. The cost-benefit analysis of scratch cooking. So it's really expensive, believe it or not, to make things from scratch. The big giant food processors out there manufacture food in huge mass quantities, and at the end, a lot of products that you would think would be less expensive to produce because you're buying them in a raw state and making them yourself end up being more expensive. How does that happen? Higher labor costs. So we make food fresh every day from scratch. If we were buying something like mayonnaise, those big manufacturing plants make 5,000 gallons of mayonnaise a day. And so the way that the labor all rolls up is much more cost effective for them. And they're located in parts of the country where labor is inexpensive, right? You all probably all have some familiarity with what it costs to live in DC. Well, the guys who work for us have to live here too. And so we pay labor costs that are fitting for the community that we're in. Higher kitchen operations costs, specialized tools, more energy to offset. Our kitchens are working 24 hours a day. We are, unfortunately, burning gas and using electricity. We buy specialized equipment, so we have special equipment that helps us make the pasta. We have special kettles so that we can make all of our own stocks and all of our own sauces. It'd be easy for us to buy chicken stock. We don't, and so the fact that we don't requires labor, a big giant kettle. We have to buy chickens and cook them ourselves. Pull the meat off the bones, use the meat, put the bones in the stock. It's a whole big process. It's really easy. I'm sure you've all been to the grocery store and bought Swanson chicken broth, right? Ever-increasing commodities. So I think that you touched on this a little bit. In recent years, lots of these prices have gone up. So it used to be when I got into the restaurant business in the 90s, prices sort of did this all year long, and it was pretty predictable. And if you just sort of waited it out, you could usually maintain a small increase. What's happened in the last 4 or 5 years that we've seen is some commodities, things like flours, egg, meat, dairy, poultry, cheese right now is through the roof. So the price of cheese in the last 3 months for us has gone up and up, which is in some ways what that does is sparks research for us. It has my boss talking about us making our own cheese, right? Which we'll see. Economies of scale. I think we've sort of touched on that. And then mass produced versus scratch made and the guest experience. So I'm proud to say we make all our own stock. It makes me proud when I can tell guests that our bucatini pasta is just unbelievable because it was made this morning. And whatever we don't use today goes in the trash and we make new again tomorrow. So we try to use our leftovers. So what I just said about the pasta bucatini going in the trash the next day, we don't want to throw anything away. We do our best not to. Pasta isn't one of those things that we have another use for, but there are lots of things that we do have other uses for. For example, we make fresh skillet cornbread every day. If you come in and you order cornbread, it was made that morning, it's hot, it's delicious, it's crispy. And if we don't sell it all, it turns into croutons or it goes into cornbread stuffing. We try really hard for all those products to find another use and another use and another use. I was in a restaurant just this morning working on prime rib. So we serve fresh prime rib every night to our guests. It was cooked an hour maybe before you order it. Very popular. And then the next day we shave the prime rib. We make fresh au jus. We warm it in the au jus. Hopefully I'm making you hungry. You're gonna go to the restaurant when you're done. And this morning we were working on what I said was, can we be better at not having leftovers so that we can make the sandwiches from fresh prime rib? And of course the chefs look at me like, get out of here. But that's the kind of work that we do. So we use the trimmings from the prime rib to make the au jus. I could kind of go on, but at some point you'll get really hungry and really bored. So we promise you true food and drink made from scratch every day. For us, that means as natural as possible. We know where your food came from and we feel good about serving it to you. So when you talk about things like GMOs, which is a new issue in the last 18 months, I got my first phone call from a guest the other day asking if I could guarantee that everything on the menu didn't have GMOs in it. I had to tell the truth. I said, we can go through the menu and you can tell me what you're interested in having, and I can do the research right now. But I can't tell you right off the top of my head because there are some products that we buy that we don't know about. So I can tell you the ones we know for sure. Maybe can't tell you a few. It was interesting. That was the first call that I'd had, and so it was great that you brought it up. I printed out a sheet from the internet on what GMOs were and gave it to all the managers, and they're like, oh, yeah, whatever. But we'll start getting more calls, and our guests want to know if we know those things. Viewing everything through the eyes of the farmer, our brand filter. So Mike, one of my bosses, his favorite thing to say is that how grandma would have done it? So the idea that, we really want to make food from scratch with love and feel proud to serve it. Sustainability at every turn. We want to be good partners to the environment. We want to make our community better. We want to contribute positively to the industry, and at the same time be sustainable ourselves, which I talked about. And seasonal and regional whenever possible. I think I covered that. Where we are today. 3 stores and growing, which I shared with you in the beginning. We have a 4th on the way in Tyson's Corner. Plan to open another store next year. Our plan is to grow locally and slowly so that we don't end up pushing ourselves into a corner where we're diluting the brand because we're growing so fast. For those of you who've ever worked in a restaurant or ever maybe had the opportunity to help open one, it's a huge undertaking that requires a tremendous amount of work that is far above and beyond what happens once it's open and you can just operate every day. So slow growth and local regional growth. Serving an average of more than 5,000 guests a day in each of our restaurants. That's a lot of people. It's a lot of potatoes. Keeping our promises to our guests, to our purveyors, and to ourselves and to our farmers. We're good partners with the folks that we buy food from. And so we work carefully to select the right products. We work carefully as business people to secure the right pricing. But then we're loyal to our purveyors as long as they're providing us with the products that we want to be proud to serve. I'm getting ahead of myself. I think I've covered most of this. The future holds slow and methodical growth. No 2 restaurants are the same. I didn't touch on that. So we want each restaurant to be a part of its own neighborhood. And so our restaurant out in MoCo in Montgomery County, Maryland, is a little bit different than the one in DC on Pennsylvania Avenue. The menus are similar, but they're not exactly alike. The decor is similar. It's not exactly alike. For the Tyson's location, we're calling that the Virginia Farm. So we want to make sure that when you walk into Tyson's, you know that you're in a different restaurant. Unlike some of our neighbors and competitors, we don't really want to be a chain restaurant group. The restaurants may share the same name, they may share pieces of the same name, they may share pieces of the menu, but we really want each restaurant to have its own identity and have its own place in the community. Embracing the geographical culture and food history of a location, that's what I mean when we talk about, my boss says, well, what does that mean, Virginia Farm? Fortunately, my grandparents both grew up on a farm in Virginia. I said, that means Smithfield ham, right? It means oysters on the menu. It means a whole bunch of things that are indigenous to Virginia. And Virginia is a big state, so there's a lot of cool food things that you can pull from the cultural history of Virginia. scratch food programs. I'll talk briefly about all these crazy ideas that we have. We are partnering right now with a farm called Rosetta Farms. They have cattle farms in Maryland and Pennsylvania. We're partnering to buy our own cattle, purchase whole sides of beef, and butcher them ourselves. So we're building this big butcher locker in the Tyson's restaurant, and we want to learn how to do that for ourselves. So I visited the farms 4 or 5 months ago. The cattle are all there for real, which is neat, right? They are grass-fed, corn finished. They live in big fields. The fields are beautiful. They have lots of grass. The farm practices all kinds of environmentally conscious activities. For example, the cattle have the ability to drink from a fresh stream, but they are limited in their ability to stand and poop in it because the runoff goes into it becomes Chesapeake Bay runoff. So we're proud of that partnership. It's in process. We haven't finalized all of the pieces of it yet, but our director of culinary operations was actually there today, learning more about how to do that. So we want to be able to tell you that we actually picked out your food. And so that's one thing that we're working on. We want to make our own butter. We're pondering the idea of buying fresh milk that's not pasteurized, canning more than we already do, preserving, all kinds of ideas for the future. And that sort of wraps up, hopefully I did it on time, maybe?